Self-control. The skill that makes you dangerous. There is a quality that makes certain people unusually difficult to deal with. Not difficult in the sense of unpleasant, not in the sense of conflict or aggression. Difficult in a different and more significant sense. They cannot be moved. They cannot be rattled, manipulated, pushed off their position, are drawn into reactions they did not choose. You can raise your voice at them and they respond at the same volume they were already using. You can deliver information designed to provoke and they receive it without visible agitation. You can apply the social pressures that reliably shift most people: urgency, frustration, the subtle performance of disappointment, and they do not shift. This quality is not coldness. It is not indifference to the people and situations around them. These people feel, they register. They are fully present to what is happening. What is different is the architecture of what they do with what they feel. Between the feeling and the behavior, there is something that most people do not have: space. And in that space they choose. Self-control is the most consequential and least understood form of personal power available to a human being. Not power over others. That kind of power is fragile, dependent on the compliance of others, revocable at any moment by the withdrawal of that compliance. Power over yourself, over the impulses that would otherwise run your behavior, over the emotional reactions that would otherwise dictate your responses, over the patterns that other people learn to predict and use against you. Most people spend their lives trying to influence and control external things: their results, their relationships, how they are perceived, how others behave toward them. This effort is not without value, but it is systematically limited by a foundational problem. They do not control the instrument they are using for all of this influence: themselves, their own reactions, impulses, emotional responses, and behavioral patterns are running on something closer to autopilot than to genuine deliberate choice. And an instrument that is not under your control is not fully in your service. The person who has built genuine self-control has built the foundational layer that everything else rests on: professional capability, quality of relationships, the ability to make good decisions under pressure, the capacity to be trusted by others, the internal experience of living deliberately rather than creatively. All of these are downstream of the quality that this audiobook builds. 10 chapters, each one a precise layer of the psychology of self-control: why impulses dominate most people, how composure is built and maintained, what the delayed reaction produces that the immediate one cannot, how the inner dialogue either undermines or supports every other capacity, and how the discipline that most people treat as optional gradually becomes the infrastructure of a genuinely different kind of person. That person does not react, they respond. They do not follow impulses, they choose directions. And the space between what happens to them and what they do about it, that space is where they live. Chapter 1 begins with what that space actually means. Introduction. The most underestimated power. Power is one of those words that most people think they understand and few actually do. In the conventional sense, power is external. It is resources, status, authority, the capacity to make things happen in the world through the leverage of position or wealth or influence over others. This external power is real and it matters. But there is a form of power that is prior to all of it, more foundational. more reliable, more difficult to take away, and more determinative of the actual quality of a person's life than any external form of power can be. It is the power to govern yourself. The person who cannot govern themselves is dependent in a specific and serious way. They are dependent on external conditions being favorable for their internal state to be stable. When things are going well, they are functional. When the environment produces pressure, provocation, or difficulty, they are at the mercy of whatever their automatic reactions generate. Their behavior is, in this sense, controlled by the environment rather than by themselves. The stimulus arrives and the response follows automatically, as predictably as the effect following its cause. The person who has built genuine self-control has broken this dependency. Their internal state is not primarily determined by the external environment. Their responses are not automatically produced by incoming stimuli. They maintain a degree of genuine autonomy from the conditions they move through, not because those conditions do not affect them, but because they have developed the capacity to mediate between the effect and the behavioral response in ways that most people have not. This mediation is what the word dangerous in the title of this audiobook refers to. Not dangerous in the sense of threatening or hostile. Dangerous in the sense of being genuinely difficult to exploit, manipulate, destabilize, or predict. The person with genuine self-control cannot be reliably provoked. They cannot be effectively managed through emotional leverage. They cannot be read well enough to have their reactions anticipated and used against them. They are, in a sense, a genuinely formidable presence not because of anything external, but because of the quality of their internal architecture. This audiobook builds that architecture layer by layer through the full 10 chapters that follow. The work is internal. The effects are visible everywhere. Chapter 1. Why self-control is real power. Most people spend their lives trying to control others. People with real power control themselves. This is not a moral observation, it is a strategic one. The person who spends their energy and attention on controlling the behavior of others is running a fundamentally inefficient operation. They are trying to govern something they do not own, through means that require continuous effort and that can be withdrawn or reversed at any moment. The control they achieve is always conditional on the cooperation, whether willing or coerced, of the people they are trying to control. Remove that cooperation and the control vanishes. The person who directs that same energy toward governing themselves is doing something more efficient and more durable. They are working on the one thing that is genuinely within their sphere of authority: their own reactions, responses, impulses, and choices. The self-control they build does not depend on anyone else's cooperation. It cannot be taken away by others' behavior. It is not contingent on the external environment being favorable. It is a capacity that, once built, is portable across all situations. This distinction between control and reaction defines the entire territory of this audiobook. Control is the deliberate exercise of authority over your own behavioral response. Reaction is the automatic behavioral output of the stimulus-response cycle, running without deliberate intervention, producing whatever the emotional system and the established patterns specify. Most people in most moments are reacting. They experience this as choosing, but the choice was made by the pattern, not by them. The difference between control and reaction is most visible in the moments that apply the most pressure. In easy circumstances, in neutral interactions, in the ordinary flow of a day that makes no particular demands, the distinction barely registers. Almost everyone seems in control in comfortable conditions. The real architecture of a person's self-governance becomes visible when the conditions are difficult, when the situation is designed, whether deliberately or accidentally, to produce a strong emotional response, and the question becomes what happens between the feeling and the action. The reactive person's answer, the feeling, becomes the action. The frustration becomes the sharp reply. The anxiety becomes the avoidance behavior. The injured pride becomes the defensive escalation. The pattern runs automatically, producing the behavioral output the emotional system specified, and the deliberate mind arrives to find that the response has already happened. The controlled person's answer, the feeling, is registered, held for a moment in the space that self-control creates, and then a chosen response is produced, one that may or may not resemble what the automatic system would have generated, but that was genuinely selected rather than automatically executed. The behavioral output in these two cases can sometimes look similar from the outside. The internal experience and the process that produced it are entirely different, and over time, the patterns they build and the outcomes they generate diverge significantly. Emotional discipline is the specific form of self-control that has the most immediate practical consequence, because the emotional system is the primary source of the impulses and reactions that self-control is managing. Emotional discipline is not emotional suppression. This distinction matters enormously because the confusing of the two produces a false version of self-control that is both psychologically costly and behaviorally ineffective. Suppression is the active inhibition of emotional experience, the effortful holding down of feelings that are trying to arise, the denial of emotional content, the performance of not feeling. This approach consumes significant psychological resource, tends to fail under sufficient pressure when the suppressed content forces expression, and produces a specific kind of instability. The person who suppresses their emotional experience is not in control of it. They are in a continuous struggle with it that they are temporarily winning. Emotional discipline is something different. It is not the prevention of the emotional experience, but the governance of the behavioral response to it. The feeling is real, it is acknowledged, it is present in full. What the disciplined person controls is not whether they feel, but what they do with the feeling. The frustration can be fully felt without being expressed as sharpness. The anxiety can be present without being performed as avoidance. The anger can be acknowledged internally without being translated into the behavioral output that the anger state is generating as an impulse. The practice of emotional discipline, in its most basic form, is the deliberate insertion of the question between the feeling and the behavior. What do I want to do with this? Not what is this state pushing me toward, but what do I choose to do here? That question is the act of self-control. It is not effortless, especially in the early stages of building the capacity, but it is the precise thing that separates a response from a reaction, a choice from an automatic output. Why self-control intimidates people is worth naming directly because it explains something important about what this capacity signals to others. Most social influence operates through the emotional system. The implicit or explicit threat, the disappointment display that relies on the other person's guilt response, the urgency that pressures quick decisions, The approval that can be withdrawn. These are all levers that work because they produce emotional responses in the target that then drive the target's behavior. They work on the reactive person reliably. They work on the emotionally disciplined person not at all, or very little. The person who has built genuine self-control has removed themselves from the operation of these levers. They are not susceptible to being pushed through their emotional system. They register the attempted pressure, they may feel its pull, and they make their own choice about whether to comply based on their own assessment of the situation rather than on the emotional pressure being applied to them. This makes them genuinely difficult to predict and influence. And difficulty to influence in social environments where most influence operates through the emotional lever reads as formidable, not threatening, not aggressive, simply outside the normal system of social management that most people are embedded in without realizing it. Self-control is the foundation of a different kind of presence, one that is not moved by every wind that blows through a room. One that chooses its own position rather than having a position chosen for it by whoever is currently applying the most pressure. One that is, in the deepest sense, genuinely free not from difficulty or from feeling, but from the automatic machinery that converts difficulty and feeling into behavior without deliberate participation. The chapters that follow build that freedom. Chapter 2. The Psychology of Impulse. An impulse is the mind's instant weakness. The word weakness is important here, and it should not be softened, because the accurate framing of what an impulse represents is what makes it possible to address. An impulse is not a preference, not a clear-eyed desire, not a deliberate intention. It is the behavioral output of a momentary state produced by an external trigger or an internal shift in emotional condition, generating a drive toward action that is calibrated to the state rather than to the situation, to the feeling of the moment rather than to the genuine interests of the person experiencing it. You do not choose your impulses, they arrive. The question is what you do with them once they have. Understanding why impulses happen is not merely intellectually interesting. It is the foundation of the capacity to manage them. The person who understands the mechanism has the beginning of leverage over it. The person who experiences impulses as simply what they want, in the moment they arise, has no leverage at all. They are inside the mechanism without knowing it. The mechanism is this: the mind is continuously monitoring the environment and the body's internal state. When it detects something that matches an established pattern, a pattern associated with reward, with threat, with social approval or disapproval, with past positive or negative experience, it generates a response state. This response state has specific characteristics. It narrows attention toward the pattern-triggering element. It generates a felt sense of the appropriate behavioral response, and it applies motivational pressure toward that response. This mechanism is not malfunctioning when it generates impulses. It is functioning as it was shaped to function, in the environments and conditions for which this architecture was developed. Fast, automatic, pattern-based behavioral responses were adaptive, the capacity to detect and rapidly respond to threat patterns, reward patterns, and social patterns without the delay of deliberate reasoning produced better outcomes than slower, more reflective response would have. The problem is not the mechanism. The problem is that the mechanism is now operating in conditions that are structurally different from those it was shaped for, conditions in which the best response to most patterns is almost never the fastest available response. in which the behavioral outputs the impulse system generates are routinely at odds with the genuine interests of the person it is supposed to serve. The person who eats the food their body is craving in the moment is following an impulse generated by a system that was shaped to respond to caloric availability with immediate consumption. The person who sends the sharp reply that their emotional state is driving is following an impulse generated by a system that was shaped to respond to social threat with rapid defensive behavior. The person who makes the impulsive purchase, the impulsive commitment, the impulsive decision to avoid the uncomfortable conversation each is following the output of a system whose calibration is misaligned with their actual interests in that specific modern context. Emotional hijacking is the term for what happens when the impulse system overrides the deliberate reasoning process not just behaviorally but cognitively. This is the more severe and more consequential form of impulse domination, and understanding it changes the level at which self-control needs to be built. In mild impulse situations, the deliberate mind is present and aware of what the impulse system is generating. It can observe the impulse, evaluate it, and choose whether to act on it. The impulse is a pull that the deliberate mind can resist because the deliberate mind is still operational. In emotional hijacking, the activation of the emotional state is strong enough to impair the operation of the deliberate reasoning system itself. The reasoning that occurs is not the balanced, multi-perspective evaluation that a clear state would produce. It is reasoning that is serving the emotional state, generating justifications for what the emotional state has already determined should happen. Finding evidence for the conclusions the state prefers, constructing arguments that sound deliberate but are actually the rationalization of what the impulse had already decided. This is the internal experience of emotional hijacking. It feels like clear thinking. It feels like you are reasoning through the situation. The reasoning is fluid, internally consistent, and arrives at conclusions with what feels like genuine conviction. What the person who has been emotionally hijacked cannot see, from inside the state, is that the conclusion was reached before the reasoning began, that the reasoning is serving the conclusion rather than evaluating it. The signs of emotional hijacking, viewed from the outside or recognized through practiced self-observation, are specific. The reasoning that is produced finds no genuine weaknesses in the position the emotional state prefers. The counter-arguments considered or readily dismissed. The urgency to act on the conclusion is elevated, and the certainty about the rightness of the generated conclusion is higher than the quality of the evidence warrants. The self-control practice that addresses emotional hijacking is not reasoning against the conclusion once the hijacking has occurred that is too late, because the reasoning system is already compromised. It is the recognition of the hijacking state itself, and the deliberate delay of behavioral output until the intensity of the emotional state has reduced enough for genuine reasoning to become available. The illusion of immediate satisfaction is the specific cognitive distortion that makes impulsive behavior so persistently attractive despite its consistent pattern of producing worse outcomes than delayed, considered behavior. The illusion works through two simultaneous distortions that the impulse state produces. The first is the overweighting of immediate consequences. In the impulse state, the relief or pleasure or resolution that the immediate behavioral output will produce is experienced as significantly more valuable than it actually is, more intensely desirable, more immediately necessary, more capable of satisfying the underlying need. This overweighting makes the immediate action feel obviously right in a way that a more balanced evaluation would not support. The second distortion is the underweighting of delayed consequences. The costs that will arrive later, the relationship damage from the sharp reply, the financial consequences of the impulsive purchase, the compounding difficulty that results from the avoided conversation are experienced as significantly less real and less weighty than they actually will be. They are present in some abstract sense in the awareness, but they do not carry their full motivational weight because they are temporally distant and therefore less emotionally activated. The combination of these two distortions makes the impulsive choice feel like the obviously correct choice in the moment. The immediate gain is vivid and feels large. The delayed cost is abstract and feels small. The choice looks straightforward. The person acts. The immediate consequence arrives roughly as anticipated, and the delayed consequences then develop in a way that was fully predictable and was not adequately weighted in the decision. This pattern repeats. The same distortions produce the same overweighting and underweighting in the next impulsive situation. Without specific intervention, without the deliberate practice of adjusting for the known distortions, the pattern runs indefinitely, generating a persistent gap between the choices people make and the choices that would actually serve their interests. The intervention is not complicated. It is the simple, consistent practice of asking before acting on a strong impulse what the actual full consequence of this action is. Not just in the next hour, in the next month, in the relationship across the next year. In the pattern of behavior, this choice is either reinforcing or interrupting. That question does not eliminate the impulse. It does not need to. It rebalances the distorted weighting, making the delayed consequences more present, the immediate gain more accurately assessed, and the rebalanced assessment, in a large proportion of cases, produces a different behavioral choice than the unexamined impulse would have. This is the beginning of the gap that self-control creates. Chapter 3. The Silent Strength. People respect those who cannot be provoked. This is not just an observation about how composed people are perceived. It is a statement about a specific form of social power that is built not through action, not through assertion or display, but through the consistent demonstration of something more compelling than either the inability to be destabilized. Every social environment contains people who probe, whether consciously or not. They make comments calibrated to produce a response. They test boundaries through implication, through the barely too direct observation, through the challenge delivered with just enough social cover that a direct response would look thin-skinned. They apply social pressure through the withdrawal of warmth, the elevated eyebrow, the public skepticism, and they watch for the reaction, for the evidence that the person on the receiving end can be moved, pushed off their ground, brought into the emotional register that the provocation was designed to produce. The person who reacts is providing information. They are demonstrating where the levers are. They are showing which comments land, which situations unsettle them, which type of pressure gets through. This information does not disappear. It is retained, consciously or unconsciously, and it shapes how that person is engaged within all subsequent interactions. The reactive person is, in a genuine sense, easier to deal with because they can be predicted and influenced through the emotional responses they have demonstrated. The person who does not react is providing different information. They are demonstrating that the standard levers do not work on them, that provocation does not produce the provoked state, that pressure does not produce the pressured response. This demonstration does not need to be dramatic or deliberate to be noticed. It is registered automatically by the people around them, and it changes the quality of how they are treated. Emotional composure is the specific capacity that produces this non-reaction, and it is worth distinguishing from the related but different qualities that are sometimes confused with it. Composure is not stonewalling, the deliberate refusal to engage that is itself a reactive behavior, a defense mechanism that announces its own emotional activation. Composure is not coldness, the effective withdrawal that communicates disengagement from the situation and the people in it. Composure is not the performance of calm over a turbulent interior, the forced presentation of stillness that costs significant psychological resource to maintain, and that careful observers can often detect as performance. Genuine composure is the actual regulated state, the internal condition in which the emotional system is activated but not overrunning the regulatory capacity, in which the feeling is present but not dictating the behavioral output, in which the person is fully present to the situation and genuinely unmoved by the elements of it that were designed to move them. This state is not the absence of feeling. It is the presence of the governing capacity alongside the feeling. Both are real. The composure is what keeps the feeling in its proper role as information and as internal experience, rather than as the director of behavior. Calm reactions are the visible expression of this internal composure, and they have specific effects in social situations that go well beyond the management of the immediate interaction. A calm reaction to a provocation does several things simultaneously in the social environment. It denies the provocation its intended effect, the visible disturbance that the provoking behavior was designed to produce. It provides the provoked person with the distinct social advantage of appearing more measured and more reliable than the provoking person. And it begins to apply a kind of reverse pressure, the pressure of contrast, in which the calm response to escalation implicitly highlights the lack of calibration in the escalation itself. This last effect is particularly significant in most social environments. The person who is visibly escalating while the other person remains calm is gradually losing the social evaluation competition, not through any action on the calm person's part, but through the contrast that the calm response makes visible. The escalation looks worse the calmer the contrast. The calm looks more controlled the more the contrast escalates. The practical skill of producing calm reactions under conditions of provocation is not the suppression of the emotional response, it is the development of the habit of the delay, the insertion of a beat between the reception of the provocation and the behavioral output of the response. That beat is where the choice lies. In the beat, the question can be asked, what response here actually serves me? Not what does the state want to do? Not what would feel satisfying in the next 3 seconds, what response in this situation actually serves my genuine interests across the next 3 hours, 3 days, 3 years? The answer to that question, in the large majority of provocative situations, is a measured, calm response, not because calm is always right. There are situations that require direct, forceful engagement, but because the reactive, emotionally driven response is almost never the strategically correct one, and the calm response almost always is. Psychological dominance is what this consistent, demonstrated composure produces over time. The word dominance is not used here in the sense of hierarchy or control over others. It is used in the specific sense of the stable, unshakable groundedness that establishes the psychological terms on which interactions occur. The person with psychological dominance in this sense sets the emotional register of their interactions, rather than having it set for them by other states. They are the emotional anchor, the presence in a room or a conversation from which the relational tone tends to be established. Not because they are loudest or most assertive, but because they are the most consistent. Their internal state does not follow the fluctuations of the social environment around them. And because it does not follow, it tends gradually, by the mechanism of emotional contagion working in reverse, to draw other states toward it rather than being drawn toward theirs. This is the silent strength that the chapter's title names. It is silent because it does not announce itself. It produces its effects through presence and consistency rather than through action and assertion. It is strength because it is the genuine exercise of governing capacity not over anyone else, but over the self, which is the only governance that actually belongs to you. Build that governance, the effects follow. Chapter 4. The power of delayed reaction. The strongest reaction is the controlled one. This statement runs directly against the intuition that most people carry about what strength of reaction means. In the common understanding, a strong reaction is a large reaction, one that is visible, immediate, forceful, clearly communicating the intensity of the feeling behind it. The person who responds immediately and with evident emotional forces. In this understanding, reacting strongly, the person who responds slowly, calmly, with measured precision is reacting weakly. This understanding is precisely inverted from what actually constitutes strength. An immediate, emotionally driven reaction is not strong, it is automatic. It is the behavioral output of the activated emotional state running without the intervention of deliberate governance. The person who reacts this way is not exercising control, they are demonstrating its absence. The situation has determined the response. The person simply executed it. The controlled reaction, the one that arrives after a deliberate delay, that has been chosen rather than automatically generated, that communicates precisely what the person intended to communicate rather than what the emotional state was producing. This is the genuinely strong reaction. It required the internal exercise of the most demanding form of self-governance, the capacity to hold the automatic output of the activated state in suspension long enough to choose something different. Response versus reaction is the central distinction of this chapter, and its implications are worth following in detail because they reveal what the delayed response actually accomplishes that the immediate reaction cannot. A reaction is automatic, state-driven, calibrated to the feeling of the moment rather than to a deliberate assessment of what the moment requires. It is produced by the pattern matching and impulse-generating systems described in Chapter 2, operating at the speed of the emotional system. The reaction arrives fast. Its content is determined before deliberate judgment has been applied to it. It carries the full distortion of the current emotional state, the amplification of threat, the compression of the time horizon, the narrowing of available options, the false confidence in the first available behavioral output. A response is deliberate, assessment-driven, calibrated to what the person judges the situation actually requires. It takes longer to produce than the reaction would have, sometimes seconds. sometimes minutes, sometimes the decision to wait until tomorrow. Its content is determined after deliberate consideration rather than before it. It carries the full access to the person's genuine judgment, values, and strategic thinking that the emotional distortion of the reaction was blocking. The difference in behavioral output between these two is not always dramatic. Sometimes the reaction and the response would have produced similar actions. But the process is entirely different, the reliability is entirely different, and across many situations the cumulative difference in outcomes is significant. The thinking gap is what the delay creates, the space between the impulse and the action in which the quality of the choice genuinely improves. The thinking gap is not primarily about the quantity of thinking that occurs in it. A long, elaborate deliberation in the thinking gap does not necessarily produce a better response than a brief, focused one. What matters is the quality of access to genuine judgment that the gap provides. When the emotional activation is at its peak, when the anger, the anxiety, the injured pride, or the urgency is strongest, the deliberate mind's access to genuine judgment is significantly impaired. The reasoning that feels clear in that state is not the reasoning of a clear state. It is the reasoning of an activated state, which carries all the systematic biases that activation produces. The confidence is high and the calibration is poor. As the activation decreases from its peak, as the neuropamine cascade of the emotional response is metabolized and the intensity of the state reduces, the access to genuine judgment gradually returns. The thinking gap is the interval between the peak of activation and the behavioral response that allows this return to progress enough that the response benefits from actual judgment rather than from the activated state's version of it. The thinking gap does not need to be long. In many situations, 30 seconds is sufficient enough time for the sharpest edge of the activation to reduce. Enough time to ask the single most important question about the situation. Enough time to identify at least one alternative to the automatic response. In situations where the activation is very strong, the gap may need to be longer. The decision to sleep on a major response, to draft but not send a message, to revisit the situation in the morning rather than acting from the current state. The practice of building the thinking gap is the practice of building self-control at the behavioral level. Every time the automatic response is held for even a brief moment, the habit of the gap is being reinforced. Every time the held moment is used to ask what the situation actually requires rather than what the emotional state is generating as output. The quality of judgment available in the gap is being tested and practiced. Strategic emotional timing is the sophisticated application of this practice, not just delaying the reaction, but choosing deliberately when and how to express emotional content for maximum effectiveness. Every emotional situation has an optimal timing for the most effective response. The optimal timing is almost never the moment of maximum activation, the peak of frustration, anger, or distress. The person at the peak of activation is producing a response that is calibrated to the emotional state rather than to the strategic requirements of the situation. The response may be powerful in the sense of forceful. It is rarely powerful in the sense of effective. The optimal timing for most emotionally charged responses is somewhere after the peak, when the emotional state has informed the assessment of the situation without distorting it. When the genuine content of what needs to be communicated has been identified and is being expressed deliberately. And when the behavioral output is the result of a choice about what to communicate rather than an automatic discharge of the activated state. This timing cannot be achieved without the thinking gap. The thinking gap is not a luxury of calm situations. It is the specific mechanism through which emotional situations are navigated with genuine control rather than with the automatic output of activation. Every significant emotional situation deserves at least a small one. The discipline to create it consistently in the moments when the pull toward immediate reaction is strongest is where the real work of self-control lies. Not in the comfortable moments, in the moments that most powerfully pull against it. Chapter 5. Mastering Inner Dialogue. Control begins with how you talk to yourself. Before any external response is produced, before any behavioral choice is made, before any of the self-control practices described in the previous chapters can operate, there is a conversation already running. It is continuous, below the level of focused awareness in most moments, shaping the interpretation of every incoming experience before the deliberate mind has formally assessed it. This conversation is the inner dialogue, and it is the first and most foundational level at which self-control either succeeds or fails. The inner dialogue is not a neutral narrator of events. It is an interpreter, one with specific habitual patterns, specific characteristic framings, specific default ways of constructing the meaning of what happens. These patterns were developed over years from the accumulated influence of formative experiences, the modeling of significant others, and the reinforcement of whatever interpretive frameworks produced the most emotionally effective responses in the environments in which they were built. They are automatic. They arrive with the experience rather than after deliberate consideration of it. And because they arrive with the experience, because the interpretation is constructed before the deliberate mind has been consulted, the interpretation feels like perception, like what happened rather than like one possible reading of what happened. The frustrating event does not arrive as a neutral event that you then interpret as frustrating. It arrives as frustrating with the interpretive frame already applied and the emotional response already initiated. This is why the inner dialogue is the level at which self-control most fundamentally operates. If you change the interpretation, you change the emotional response that the interpretation generates. If you change the emotional response, you change the behavioral output that the emotional state drives toward. The chain of causation runs from inner dialogue to emotion to behavior. Working only on behavior, trying to control the behavioral output without addressing the interpretive processes that produce the emotional states driving it, is working at the end of the chain and leaving the earlier links intact. What does a self-control supporting inner dialogue look like? Not an unrealistically positive one. The reflexive framing of every negative event as secretly beneficial is a form of cognitive distortion that trades one problem for another and tends to fail under genuine difficulty. Not a relentlessly neutral one, stripping the emotional content from events in an attempt to produce a flatline response. Something more precise, a dialogue that is accurate, that does not amplify what the situation contains beyond what it actually contains, and that consistently returns the assessment to what the situation actually requires rather than what the emotional state generated in response to it is demanding. The characteristic errors of the self-control undermining inner dialogue fall into specific categories. Catastrophizing is the amplification of difficulty or threat beyond what the evidence supports, the transformation of a setback into a disaster, a conflict into a crisis, a temporary condition into a permanent state. Each of these amplifications generates a stronger emotional response than the actual situation warrants, which generates a stronger impulse toward the behaviors the emotional response drives. Catastrophizing makes self-control harder by making the emotional states that self-control is managing more intense than they would be with accurate framing. Personalization is the attribution of events to your own character or value rather than to the interaction of circumstance, other people's choices, and situational factors. The project that runs into difficulty is not evidence that you are incompetent. The relationship that experiences conflict is not evidence that you are fundamentally difficult to get along with. The failure is not proof of the permanent characteristic it is being taken as evidence of. Personalization generates emotional responses that are significantly more intense and more destabilizing than the accurate interpretation of the same events would generate. It converts specific situational difficulties into threats to the self, threats that activate the defensive, protective emotional responses that are among the most disruptive to composed behavior. And it does this automatically, through the habitual interpretive pattern, before deliberate assessment has had any opportunity to correct the framing. Overgeneralization is the extension of specific experience into universal rules. The conversation that went poorly becomes evidence that you are bad at conversations generally. The period of poor performance becomes evidence that your ability is fundamentally limited. The one person who has treated you dismissively becomes evidence about how people in general relate to you. The universal framing then generates the emotional responses and behavioral dispositions appropriate to a universal problem rather than a specific one, which are significantly more costly and significantly harder to address than the specific problem actually is. Correcting these patterns is not done through positive thinking, the mechanical replacement of negative interpretations with positive ones. Regardless of the evidence, it is done through the practice of accuracy when the automatic interpretation arrives, asking whether it is actually supported by the evidence or whether it has been amplified, personalized, or overgeneralized beyond what the specific situation contains. This questioning is the practice of inner dialogue mastery, not the automatic acceptance of the first interpretation the pattern produces, not the reflexive replacement of that interpretation with a more comfortable one. The deliberate, honest assessment of whether the interpretation is calibrated to what has actually happened. The self-talk that emerges from this practice is qualitatively different from either the catastrophizing, personalizing, overgeneralizing inner dialogue that undermines self-control or the forced positivity that denies genuine difficulty. It is specific. This specific situation has these specific features. It is proportionate. The response called for is proportionate to what this situation actually contains, not to an amplified version of it. It is actionable. What, given this accurate framing, is the useful next response? The quality of the inner dialogue determines the quality of the emotional states that inner dialogue produces. The quality of the emotional states determines the quality of the self-control that is required to manage them. The person whose inner dialogue consistently amplifies, personalizes, And covert generalizers will always be working harder at self-control than the person whose inner dialogue is accurate and proportionate because they are managing more intense and more frequent emotional activations for the same set of external events. This is where the leverage is, in the dialogue before everything else. Chapter 6. Discipline over motivation. Motivation disappears, discipline remains. This is not a criticism of motivation. Motivation is real. It is valuable, and it is the energy that initiates much of what people start. But it has a specific structural property that makes it insufficient as the basis for self-control. It is state-dependent. Motivation is present when conditions are favorable, when the goal feels vivid, when progress is visible, when the emotional state is one that amplifies the value of the objective and makes the effort required feel proportionate to the reward anticipated. The conditions for motivation are not the conditions under which self-control is most needed. Self-control is most needed precisely in the conditions where motivation is least available, when the goal feels distant, when progress is invisible or reversed, when the emotional state is making the immediate cost of the disciplined choice feel large and the delayed reward feel remote. In those conditions, which are the normal conditions of any serious long-term pursuit, motivation has largely withdrawn. It does not survive contact with sustained difficulty. It does not maintain itself through extended periods of unrewarded effort. It dissipates under fatigue, frustration, and the accumulated weight of the gap between current reality and the desired state. Discipline is what occupies the space that motivation vacates. Discipline is not the same thing as willpower, and the distinction matters because the conventional framing of willpower as limited reserve has led many people to conclude that discipline is inherently unreliable, that it depletes and therefore cannot be the foundation of consistent behavior. This conclusion is accurate about a specific kind of force suppression, but does not accurately describe the discipline that this chapter is building. The depleting kind of self-control is the kind that operates through continuous resistance, through the continuous effortful suppression of desires and impulses that remain active, that must be repeatedly held down, and that consume regulatory resource with each act of suppression. This kind of self-control does deplete. It is not sustainable as the primary mechanism of consistent disciplined behavior because the resource it consumes is finite and refills slowly. The non-depleting kind of discipline operates through a different mechanism, not the suppression of the undisciplined impulse, but the construction of a stable identity and a set of stable habits that make the undisciplined option less compelling to begin with. The person whose identity is organized around the disciplined choice does not experience each instance of the disciplined behavior as a resource-consuming act of suppression. They experience it as the expression of who they are. The alternative is not a temptation being overcome. It is something outside the range of what this person does. This is the shift from willpower-based self-control to identity-based self-control, and it is one of the most practically significant transitions in the development of genuine discipline. How this shift occurs is through the specific accumulation of behavioral evidence. The identity of a disciplined person is not built through the intention to be disciplined, the aspiration to be disciplined, or the belief that being disciplined is important. It is built through the repeated, consistent behavioral demonstration of disciplined choice across ordinary circumstances, the accumulated record of having done the thing rather than the easier thing. in the situations where the easier thing was what the immediate state was driving toward. This accumulation does not require dramatic acts of self-denial or exceptional circumstances. It is built in the unremarkable moments of ordinary days, the conversation where the reactive response was held and the considered one was offered instead. The session of work completed when the pull toward distraction was strong. The commitment honored when the motivation for it had dissipated. The impulse recognized and evaluated rather than automatically executed. Each of these instances is small. Each is a piece of behavioral evidence that the identity incorporates. The accumulation of many pieces of evidence eventually produces a self-concept, a stable internal image of who you are, in which the disciplined behavior is not something you are trying to do but something you do. The shift is not announced. It is registered gradually. Through the changed internal experience of the behavioral choices, they become the natural expression of the person rather than an effortful departure from their natural inclinations. The practical architecture of building discipline over motivation requires the establishment of systems that do not depend on the motivational state being favorable. Routines that are executed not because they feel good today, but because they are what is done on these days at this time. Commitments that are honored not because the motivation for them is present, but because the commitment has been made. Behavioral standards that apply regardless of how the emotional state is appraising them in the moment. These systems do not eliminate the need for any effort. They redirect the effort from the high-cost act of resisting temptation in the moment to the lower-cost act of maintaining the system. Once the routine is established, once the behavior is expected, and the deviation is the thing that requires justification, the system runs with significantly less resource expenditure than the moment-by-moment motivational management it replaces. The period of system establishment is when the motivation-discipline gap is most visible. In the early phases of building any discipline, motivation has not yet been replaced by habit and identity. The behavior requires deliberate effort that the motivation may or may not be available to support. This is the period when the decision to maintain discipline despite the absence of motivation is most critical, because it is this very decision, repeated across the early phase of building, that creates the habit and the identity evidence that eventually makes the discipline automatic. The discipline you build in the absence of motivation is worth more than the behavior you produce in its presence, because the motivation will always return in good conditions. The discipline is what covers the conditions where motivation does not. And it is in those conditions, the difficult ones, the discouraging ones, the ones where every internal signal is pointing toward the easier option, that self-control is what it actually is. Not a quality you have when it is convenient, a quality you have when you need it. Chapter 7. Resisting emotional traps. Some people try to manage you through your emotions. This is not paranoia, it is observation. Every social environment contains people who have learned, through experience, that emotional levers are among the most effective tools for influencing others' behavior. Not necessarily through malicious design. Many of the people who use emotional leverage do so automatically, having learned early that guilt, urgency, obligation, shame, or flattery reliably produce the responses they needed in the people around them. The strategy is not always deliberate. The effect is always real. Understanding emotional traps is not about treating all social influence as manipulation or approaching relationships with suspicion. It is about developing the perceptual capacity to recognize when behavioral pressure is being applied through the emotional system rather than through transparent engagement with your genuine interests, and developing the self-control to respond from your own assessment rather than from the emotional state the pressure has produced. The emotional traps that appear most frequently in ordinary social environments share a common structure. They produce a state in which the choice the other person wants you to make appears to be the choice your own emotional response is driving toward. The trap works when the distinction between your own genuine assessment of the situation and the emotional state that has been deliberately or instinctively generated in you is invisible. When the triggered feeling feels like your own clear perception rather than like the result of a managed influence. The guilt trap is among the most common and most reliably effective. It works by linking a specific behavior to a negative self-evaluation by framing a particular choice as evidence of a character flaw, as a failure of obligation, or as the cause of someone else's suffering that you are responsible for preventing. The guilt that is generated feels like moral information, like your conscience telling you something important about what the right choice is. And because guilt feels like conscience, acting to relieve it feels like acting from integrity rather than from social pressure. The recognition of the guilt trap requires distinguishing between guilt as genuine moral information, the response to having actually acted against your values, and guilt as generated pressure, the response to someone else's framing of your choices in ways that trigger the guilt response regardless of whether your actual values are being violated. The distinction is not always easy, but it is available through the question, would I? Evaluating this choice on its merits without the emotional pressure currently being applied. Conclude that choosing otherwise is actually a violation of values I hold? If the answer to that question, in the absence of the triggered emotional state, is not clearly yes, the guilt is more likely pressure than genuine moral information. The urgency trap is the application of artificial time pressure to decisions that do not actually have the time constraints being implied. The mechanism is straightforward. The sense of urgency activates the fast mode processing described in earlier chapters, compresses the time horizon of evaluation, and pushes toward the first available option, which is often the option the urgency producer preferred from the beginning. The urgency is real as a feeling. The time constraint it is communicating is often not real as a fact. Recognizing the urgency trap begins with the specific question from Chapter 2 applied to social situations. Is this situation actually requiring a decision in the time frame being communicated? Or is the urgency a feature of the way the situation is being presented rather than of the situation itself? Separating the feeling of urgency from the actual available time for deliberation and making decisions based on the actual timeline rather than the communicated one is the specific response to this trap. The flattery trap operates by activating the approval-seeking impulse and then using the desire to maintain the approval as leverage for compliance. The mechanism is the sequencing first, establish positive regard through genuine or manufactured compliment. You are uniquely capable. You have always been so generous. No one understands this as well as you do. Then present the request or the expectation in a way that frames compliance as the expression of the just affirmed positive quality. The declining of the request becomes, within the established frame, an inconsistency with who you were just told you are. The recognition and resistance of emotional traps does not require the elimination of social warmth. the suspicious interrogation of all positive regard, or the assumption that every expression of need is manipulation. It requires the maintenance of the distinction between the emotional state that a social situation has produced in you and your own genuine assessment of what the situation requires. That maintenance is the specific self-control practice of this chapter when a social situation produces a strong emotional pull toward a specific behavior. Deliberately step back from the emotional state enough to ask whether this pull reflects your own considered judgment or reflects the effect of a social influence process. Not as a refusal to ever act from emotional states. There are situations where the emotional response is providing genuinely accurate information about what the right choice is, but as a consistent check that the choice being driven by the emotional state is one you would endorse from a less activated position. The person who maintains this check is not immune to social influence. No one is. And the attempt to be would cut off the genuine information that other people's emotional states provide. They are simply not automatically determined by it. They feel the pull. They assess the pull. They choose what to do based on their own judgment rather than on the strength of the feeling. This is not defensiveness. It is sovereignty. The governed self, receiving social input, processing it genuinely, and responding from its own assessment rather than the pressured self. Receiving social input, being moved by it, and executing what the movement generates. Chapter 8. Psychological Immunity. When you control yourself, no one else controls you. This is the logic of psychological immunity, and it is worth tracing carefully because it explains something important about the relationship between self-control and freedom from external influence. Most forms of influence over another person's behavior operate through the same basic mechanism. They generate an internal state in that person, an emotional response, a felt need, a social pressure, and rely on that internal state to drive the behavioral output they want. The influence is effective when the internal state successfully determines the behavioral output. The influence fails when the internal state is received and processed without automatically producing the behavioral output it was driving toward. Self-control is precisely the capacity that interrupts this mechanism. Not by preventing the internal state from being generated. You cannot always control what you feel in response to incoming information. And the attempt to prevent all internal response produces the suppression problems described in earlier chapters. By interrupting the automatic translation of the internal state into behavioral output, by maintaining the thinking gap in which the generated internal state is received, assessed, and responded to from genuine judgment rather than automatic execution. The person who has built genuine self-control has built psychological immunity in this specific sense, not immunity to feeling, but immunity to being behaviorally determined by feeling. The internal state is real. What it generates in behavior is not predetermined. This breaks the influence mechanism at its critical point, the translation from internal state to behavior, and makes the person genuinely less susceptible to all the forms of social and situational influence that operate through this mechanism. Psychological immunity develops through the consistent application of what might be called the Krebschen-Evaluation-Hoist sequence, in place of the automatic Krebschen-Execution sequence that characterizes reactive behavior. Reception is the unavoidable first step. Something happens, an event, a comment, a situation, and the emotional system generates a response. This response is real and it is registered. The self-controlled person does not deny the reception. They fully receive it. Evaluation is the inserted second step. The internal state that has been generated is examined rather than immediately executed. What is this state? What produced it? Is this response proportionate to what has actually happened? Or is it amplified by the patterns and sensitivities described in Chapter 5? Is there a decision required here, and if so, what are the actual options rather than just the one the activated state is driving toward? Choice is the third step. Based on the evaluation, a response is selected, not automatically generated. Selected from the range of available options with genuine awareness of what the selection is and why, rather than produced automatically by the activated state without deliberate participation. The practice of this sequence in ordinary daily interactions in the situations that produce mild emotional responses as well as the ones that produce strong ones builds the automatic evaluation habit that eventually makes the sequence itself more efficient. In the early stages, the evaluation is effortful and deliberate. With consistent practice, it becomes a natural part of the processing of incoming events, not a special intervention reserved for high-stakes moments, but the standard operating procedure of the self-controlled mind. The specific qualities that psychological immunity produces in social environments are worth describing in detail, because they compound each other in ways that are more significant than any single quality in isolation. The first quality is unpredictability to those who would influence through the emotional lever. As noted in Chapter 3, the reactive person provides information about where the levers are. They show which inputs produce which outputs. The self-controlled person does not provide this information because the input-to-output relationship has been disrupted. The same input that reliably produces a specific output in a reactive person does not reliably produce that output in the person whose evaluation step interrupts the automatic execution. This unpredictability is protective without requiring any deliberate defense. It is the natural consequence of the self-control itself. The person who cannot be reliably provoked cannot be managed through provocation. The person whose approval seeking can be interrupted cannot be managed through the strategic deployment of approval. The person who can hold the urgency illusion at arm's length cannot be rushed into decisions through manufactured time pressure. The second quality is consistency. The self-controlled person behaves consistently across different emotional conditions, across the conditions in which they feel positive and the conditions in which they feel pressured, across the situations in which the easy choice is also the right one and the situations in which they diverge. This consistency is directly experienced by the people around them as reliability, as trustworthiness, as the quality of being someone whose behavior can be predicted from their stated values rather than from their emotional state in any given moment. Trust, in most real-world contexts, is built on exactly this quality: the consistency between stated values and actual behavior across varied conditions. The self-controlled person builds trust more rapidly and more durably than the reactive person, not because they are more likable or more impressive in any given moment, but because their behavior provides the kind of evidence that trust is actually built from the evidence of consistency. The third quality is the internal experience of equanimity, the stable baseline of internal experience that is less dependent on the fluctuations of external conditions than the reactive person's internal experience is. The reactive person's internal state follows the environment when things are going well. They feel well when things are difficult. They feel bad when they are provoked. They feel agitated. The quality of their internal experience is largely determined by what is happening around them. The self-controlled person's internal state is more insulated from this determination. Not perfectly insulated, significant events genuinely affect everyone, but less immediately, less completely, and with better capacity for return to baseline after activation. The internal experience is more stable because the emotional system's outputs are not immediately executing as behavioral and experiential states, but are being received, evaluated, and chosen from. This stability is not purchased through disconnection from experience. It is the product of the capacity to be present to experience without being governed by it, fully in the situation, genuinely feeling what the situation contains, and still fundamentally in charge of what happens next. Chapter 9. Becoming unpredictable. People cannot manipulate what they cannot read. The predictable person is a manageable person. This is not a cynical claim about the intentions of the people around you. It is a description of how social dynamics work when the behavioral patterns of one person become visible and legible enough to other people to be factored into their interactions. Every person who is consistently in your life develops a model of you, not a fully accurate or consciously elaborated model, an implicit, intuitive model built from the observed pattern of how you behave in response to specific types of situations. They know, without having explicitly thought it through, what kinds of comments make you defensive and what kinds make you warm. They know what type of request you will agree to and which type you will decline. They know what emotional approach will move you and what will not. They know where the edges of your composure are, because they have seen those edges in the moments when the pattern of your behavior revealed that you had reached them. This model serves some legitimate purposes. It enables the effective coordination of interaction, the knowing of what can be discussed easily and what requires more care, of what you care about and what you are indifferent to. This is normal and not problematic. What is problematic is when the model is accurate enough to be used to produce specific responses from you on demand. When the people who have built the model can deploy specific inputs, specific framings, specific emotional approaches, specific social pressures, and reliably generate the desired outputs from you, without your deliberate participation in that process. This is the management of a person through their behavioral predictability, and it operates entirely at the level of the established patterns rather than at the level of genuine engagement with your considered judgment. Becoming less predictable in the sense that matters is not about introducing randomness into your behavior or about making yourself difficult to engage with. It is about breaking the specific predictability of your reactive patterns, the reliable connections between specific emotional inputs and specific behavioral outputs that others have learned to use. The most important form of this is breaking the predictability of your provocation responses. If specific types of comments, situations, or social approaches reliably produce specific emotional reactions in you, visible agitation, defensive escalation, withdrawal, compliance, then whoever has observed this pattern has discovered a lever. They may not use it deliberately, but its existence in the available repertoire of social interaction means that it may be used, deliberately or instinctively, when the behavioral output it produces is wanted. Self-control removes this lever, not by pretending the triggering input has no effect. It will still register, It will still produce an internal response, but by interrupting the automatic translation of that internal response into the predictable behavioral output that others have learned to generate. The input arrives, the response is held. What is offered back is something that was chosen, not something that was automatically produced by the input. The practical architecture of strategic unpredictability is built on two foundations. The first is the mastery of the delay described in Chapter 4, the consistent practice of inserting the thinking gap between stimulus and response in enough situations that the automatic response pattern is no longer reliable. The delay alone changes the behavioral output in ways that disrupt the established model others have built. The second foundation is the deliberate practice of response variability, the conscious choice, in situations where you have options, to not always choose the response that the established pattern would predict. This is not perversity or inconsistency. It is the expression of genuine choice rather than automatic pattern execution. The person who sometimes responds to a challenging comment with engagement and sometimes with silence, who sometimes escalates a disagreement and sometimes de-escalates it, who sometimes complies with a social expectation and sometimes declines it, this person cannot be confidently modeled, because their behavior is not determined by the pattern but by their assessment of each specific situation. There is a specific quality that this variability produces in the people around you: heightened attention. The person who cannot be confidently predicted receives more careful engagement than the person who is fully legible. Others cannot afford to treat them as a known quantity whose responses can be anticipated and factored in without genuinely considering the specific current situation. They must pay attention. They must actually engage with what is there rather than with the model of what they expected. This heightened attention is a form of respect in the deepest sense, not the performed acknowledgement of someone's status, but the genuine orientation of genuine consideration towards someone whose inner life and behavioral responses cannot be fully anticipated. It is commanded not through assertion or demand, but through the demonstrated reality that the predictive model does not work. Becoming unpredictable in this sense is not strategic theater. It is the natural consequence of genuine self-control, of actually choosing responses from genuine assessment rather than executing automatic patterns. The unpredictability is not a tactic. It is the side effect of the fact that the behavior is now genuinely emerging from considered choice rather than from established pattern, and considered choices in varied situations do not produce the mechanical regularity of pattern-driven behavior. The person who has built genuine self-control is not performing unpredictability. They are simply no longer predictable in the ways that make people manageable, because the machinery that produces the predictable patterns is no longer running uninterrupted. This is one of the most concrete and practical consequences of the entire project this audiobook is building. Chapter 10: The Discipline That Changes Everything. Self-control is the foundation all other strengths rest on. The claim this chapter's hook makes is significant enough to require substantiation rather than simply assertion. In what sense is self-control the foundation of all other strengths? Not in the sense that it replaces other qualities: intelligence, skill, knowledge, judgment, or that it alone is sufficient for any important achievement. In the sense that it is the governing capacity that determines whether all the other qualities a person has are available to them when they need them. Consider intelligence. The highly intelligent person who cannot govern their impulses produces the most internally convincing rationalizations for the reactive choice, which makes them more confidently wrong than the less intelligent person who reacts with less sophisticated self-justification. Intelligence without self-control amplifies the sophistication of reactive behavior rather than replacing it. The intelligence serves whatever the reactive state is driving toward, generating compelling arguments for the conclusion the emotional system had already reached. Consider skill. Professional skill, built over years, is available in conditions of calm and accessible under pressure only to the degree that the practitioner can maintain access to their deliberate capabilities when the pressure is activating the reactive mode that crowds out deliberate processing. The skilled surgeon, the skilled negotiator, the skilled communicator, their skill is fully available only when their self-governance is sufficiently developed that the pressure conditions of their work do not degrade their access to the very capabilities they have worked to build. Consider judgment. The quality of a person's judgment is ultimately expressed through the quality of their choices. And the quality of their choices is the product of both the quality of their deliberate assessment and the degree to which that deliberate assessment is actually the thing governing their choices, rather than the emotional state of the moment being the governing factor with deliberate reasoning serving as post-rationalization. Self-control is what makes judgment consequential, what allows the judgment to actually be expressed in the choice rather than being overridden by the impulse. This is the sense in which self-control is the foundation, not because it is more important than these other qualities, but because it is the condition under which all of them are actually available and fully expressive. Without it, intelligence, skill, and judgment are partly available in comfortable conditions and significantly degraded in the conditions that most demand them. With it, they are accessible across the full range of conditions, including the difficult, pressured, emotionally activating ones where the difference between the reactive response and the governed one is most consequential. The cumulative effect of this self-control built across this audiobook is not a collection of separate capacities that operate independently. It is an integrated architecture that compounds. Each layer of the architecture supports and enables the others, and the full structure is more capable than any single layer would suggest. The emotional discipline from Chapter 1 creates the baseline capacity for governing responses rather than executing reactions. The understanding of impulse mechanisms from Chapter 2 reduces the persuasive power of the impulse. It is harder to be automatically carried by a mechanism you understand. The composed presence from Chapter 3 changes how you are perceived and engaged with, reducing the frequency and intensity of the provocative inputs that the self-control architecture has to manage. The delayed reaction practice from Chapter 4 inserts the thinking gap that all the other capacities need in order to operate. The inner dialogue mastery from Chapter 5 changes the emotional states that self-control has to manage, making them more proportionate and therefore less risk or demanding to govern. The discipline over motivation from Chapter 6 makes the self-control architecture available across the full range of conditions, including the difficult ones where motivation has withdrawn and self-governance must operate on its own. The resistance to emotional traps from Chapter 7 protects the architecture from the social engineering that specifically targets the emotional lever. The psychological immunity from Chapter 8 makes the architecture self-reinforcing. The consistent demonstration of self-control changes the social interactions you are involved in. generating environments that are less provocative and more aligned with the quality of presence you are building. The strategic unpredictability from Chapter 9 removes the behavioral legibility that would otherwise allow others to work around your self-control by reliably producing the states that override it. And this 10th chapter holds the full architecture in view, the recognition that all of this is not a collection of techniques for managing difficult situations more smoothly, but a fundamental transformation in the kind of person you are. That transformation is identity-based. It is not the performance of self-control in situations where it seems strategically advantageous. It is the development of self-control as the natural expression of who you are, the way you actually process incoming experience, generate responses, manage your inner life, and engage with the world. The shift from someone who tries to control their reactions to someone who is characterized by the governance of their reactions. From the person who applies the delay as a technique to the person for whom the delay is simply how they operate. This shift does not happen through a single decision or a single listening. It happens through the consistent behavioral practice of the capacities this audiobook describes, applied across the ordinary situations of daily life, the ones that seem small but are the actual substance of the pattern that determines who you are. Every application of the thinking gap, every recognized impulse that was evaluated rather than automatically executed, every emotional trap that was seen through, every moment of composure that was chosen in a situation that was designed to produce its opposite. These instances are not isolated, they are cumulative. They form the behavioral evidence from which the identity is built. They are the practice that eventually becomes the character, not the aspired-to character, but the demonstrated one, expressed in how you actually behave across the full range of conditions that constitute your life. You are building a person that is more difficult to move, more difficult to manage, more difficult to predict, and more capable of the full expression of their actual qualities in the conditions that most challenge those qualities. The building continues in every ordinary moment. Closing. The architecture is yours. 10 chapters, 1 architecture. And before the closing, something worth saying clearly: nothing in this audiobook produces results through understanding alone. The understanding is necessary. You cannot interrupt a mechanism you cannot see. And seeing the mechanism is the starting point for everything that follows. But the understanding is not the work. The work is behavioral. It is the 10,000 applications of the practices in the ordinary situations of ordinary days. Each one small, each one a piece of the accumulated evidence from which the disciplined person is actually built. Chapter 1 named the foundational distinction: control versus reaction, and what it actually means to govern yourself rather than to be governed by the automatic outputs of pattern and impulse. The insight that most social influence operates through the emotional lever, and that the person who has governed their emotional system has removed themselves from the operation of most of the levers that other people use. The specific form of presence that genuine self-control produces, not more forceful, not more assertive, but more genuinely free than the reactive person can be in the same situations. Chapter 2 went into the mechanism why impulses arise, what emotional hijacking looks like from the inside and from outside, and the specific cognitive distortion, the simultaneous overweighting of immediate reward and underweighting of delayed consequence that makes the impulsive choice consistently attractive despite its consistent pattern of producing worse outcomes. The intervention is the rebalancing question: what does this choice actually produce? Across the full time horizon, not just in the next hour. Chapter 3 established the social reality of self-control, the specific way that consistent composure changes how others engage with you. Not through any assertion of authority, but through the demonstrated reality of the psychological dominance that cannot be provoked. The silent strength that is built through presence rather than through action. And that establishes the emotional terms of interactions rather than following the terms others set. Chapter 4 built the core behavioral practice: the delay, the thinking gap, the specific interval between stimulus and response in which genuine choice becomes possible. The distinction between the strong reaction, which is actually the automatic execution of the activated state, and the controlled reaction, which is the genuinely strong one because it required the internal exercise of the governing capacity, and the sophisticated application: strategic emotional timing. Choosing not just whether to delay, but when and how to express emotional content for genuine rather than reactive effect. Chapter 5 went inside to the inner dialogue that precedes all emotional response and shapes it before the deliberate mind has been consulted. The specific patterns: catastrophizing, personalization, covert generalization, that amplify emotional activation beyond what situations warrant and make self-control harder by increasing the intensity of what it has to manage. And the intervention: not positive thinking, but accuracy, the honest assessment of whether the interpretation that has arrived is actually calibrated to what has happened. Chapter 6 addressed the infrastructure question: how self-control is maintained when the motivation for it has withdrawn, which is always the critical test. The distinction between willpower-based self-control depleting, based on continuous suppression, and discipline-based self-control built through identity and habit, available across the full range of conditions. The specific process by which the identity shifts not through intention, but through the accumulated behavioral evidence of having done the thing in the situations where the easier option was available. Chapter 7 mapped the social terrain: emotional traps, their specific mechanisms, and the practice of maintaining the distinction between your own genuine assessment and the emotional state that social influence processes have generated in you. Guilt, urgency, flattery, each working through the same core mechanism, each defeated by the same core practice: the evaluation of the generated internal state before it executes as behavior. Chapter 8 named what the accumulated self-control produces in psychological terms: immunity, not from feeling, but from being behaviorally determined by what others' actions generate in you. The Creeption evaluation hoist sequence that replaces the automatic Creeption execution sequence. The specific qualities that psychological immunity generates in social environments: unpredictability to those who would influence through pattern, consistency that builds trust, and the internal equanimity that is less dependent on external conditions than the reactive person's stability can ever be. Chapter 9 completed the social picture: the strategic value of breaking the behavioral predictability that makes people manageable, not through deliberate randomness, but through the natural consequence of genuine self-control: the fact that choices made from genuine assessment rather than automatic pattern execution do not produce the mechanical regularity that others' models require to work. And the specific quality that this produces in others: not confusion, but genuine attention, a heightened engagement of people who cannot afford to treat you as a known quantity. And Chapter 10 held the full architecture and view self-control as the foundation that makes all other strengths accessible. Not because it replaces them, but because it is the governing capacity that determines whether they are available in the conditions that most demand them. And the recognition that the transformation being built here is not a collection of techniques, but a different kind of person, one for whom the governed response is not an achievement, but an expression of who they are. The identity that this audiobook has been building toward is not dramatic. It does not announce itself or require external validation. It is internal, structural, expressed in the accumulated quality of ordinary interactions across ordinary days. It is the person who is harder to provoke than they used to be, who takes a beat before responding in the situations that used to produce immediate reaction, who notices the impulse forming and makes an actual choice about whether to execute it, who recognizes the emotional trap and steps around it without announcing that they have done so, who honors the commitment when the motivation for it has long since departed, who maintains the composure that others interpret as formidable presence without any performance of it. This person is more deliberate, in every sense of that word. They do not react, they respond. They do not follow impulses, they assess them and choose. They do not require favorable external conditions to maintain their internal equilibrium. And the space between what happens to them and what they do about it, that space is genuinely theirs. You have started building that space. The building continues. In every ordinary moment that follows,